think it's a good point that the question is about the process as well as, I guess, about how to achieve the SDGs. Because I think one of the important ways in which modeling can contribute to the whole effort is at the level of actually setting goals and setting targets to get a sense of what's even possible, what's within the range of possibility, where can we even get to. My own personal special area is education, which is a good example where perhaps there was too little modeling done in setting the goals or the targets this time around. Ironically, less so even than for the MDGs and EFA agenda. On the whole, the SDG process was more elaborate and more carefully considered than the MDG process. But back then, there was actually a consideration of the trend since the early 90s and an extrapolation of that, and then trying to improve on that baseline trend, setting targets that were sort of feasibly beyond that baseline trend. That didn't really happen this time around, so we've ended up with Education SDG 4.1 that is very ambitious numerically in terms of the time horizon. Of course, it's a good idea to have all children complete upper secondary schooling, but if you model this and you do a baseline projection, you see that achieving upper secondary schooling by 2030 is almost impossible because of the time lag, and you would have to have a universal entry and universal primary schooling within the next few years, or even starting now, which we simply don't have. So arguably there was perhaps too little modeling involved in setting the goals there. The other way in which modeling and projection I think makes an important contribution is in terms of the monitoring, not just to assess whether we are on track and whether we are likely to attain the target or fall short, but also to compare that to some kind of baseline trend. How much added value has the process actually generated? How much faster have things developed as a result of the SDG endeavor and the SDG effort and negotiations and target setting? How much of a difference did that actually make? Not just whether we're going to get there, but how much of a difference did it make to where we would have ended up, well, what our best guess is of where we would have ended up one way or another. It's difficult to avoid sort of arguing that your own special area of interest is sort of at the core of the SDG agenda and the single most important one. So I wouldn't want to engage in that kind of, pointless and counterproductive competition. Having said that, I think education takes a special place and a special role. On the one hand, if you take the literal SDG agenda up to 2030, there are a lot of synergies, ways in which education contributes to other development outcomes, but most of them are actually long-term. So in terms of reaching other targets by 2030, education has relatively little, so the multiplier effect isn't there yet. But the opposite is true if you take the long-term view. So it's literally true that the way education contributes, potentially contributes, and in fact typically does contribute to other development goals, fills a book, because together with some colleagues we just wrote one on specifically that topic, which is coming out in a couple of months' time, looking at how education enables the SDG agenda. The other factor that I think is important in that context is that this is something that we and governments want to do and are committed to do anyhow. So a lot of the goals, well, we know that a lot of the goals aren't necessarily very highly operationalized. Many don't even have numerical targets, but even the ones that do, a lot of them are things that can be influenced only indirectly. So we might have the aspiration to, lower extreme poverty, but and it is of course possible, and increasingly people are trying literally just to give cash to the poor, but that's not generally how we reduce extreme poverty, not just by handing out cash to the extent that is required to meet those targets. Whereas in education, there are, of course, difficulties in achieving universal access in schooling, but in principle, we know what to do, and this is something we want to do anyhow. And importantly, this is something that does squarely fall within the responsibility of the public sector and governments. It is the government's job to provide and offer schooling, high-quality, equitable schooling to everyone. This is not something that we have to think about how to achieve that indirectly and trying to come up with creative policies of trying to reduce child marriage or trying to reduce pollution and poverty. This is a very direct sort of one-to-one task and responsibility. So I think in that sense, even though historically, we failed to achieve the education for all goals and the MDG goals, it's not that it's simple. So it's certainly not low-hanging fruit in that sense, but sort of conceptually it is low-hanging fruit. We know roughly what we are trying to do. It's something we should be doing one way or another. And at the same time, in the long and medium term, it offers many multiplier effects. So that's what I would argue for the case of education.